The foundation asked me to moderate this session on economic reconstruction for Ukraine on the assumption, quite valid, that I'm the least qualified person on this panel. And so I should be asking questions, and I would try to do that. We, instead of moderating, what we'll do, try to do, is to have a conversation among us first, to talk about the themes of reimagining reconstruction for Ukraine. And then we'll open it up to any questions from the audience. I know Kurt has to leave, so I'm going to ask him first that you've been in this space for quite a long time in terms of transatlantic support for Ukraine. I know also that you've traveled quite a bit to Europe the last few months. How would you assess the situation we're in right now? There's been lots of nice conferences in Lugano at the beginning of July, in Berlin at the end of October, where both of us were at, and somehow we missed seeing each other. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of discussion about a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which is a good analogy. But what you don't see is a lot of organization and a readiness to execute a plan. There are more meetings that will be happening soon, I think in Poland next week, and then in France the week after. How would you assess where we are now in terms of reconstruction for Ukraine? And are we prepared as we should be, to start executing rather than talking about a new Marshall Plan?
Well, thanks very much, Ed. And I think you're going to find that Anders and I say almost exactly the same thing, because Anders and I have been emailing back and forth and writing similar things about this. But let me address your question and put it in some context. I'd say that the most important thing right now remains Ukraine winning the war, making sure that Russia's defeated. It's not done yet. There's a lot left to do, and Russia is making it as miserable as they can for the Ukrainian people. So we have to stay focused on that. But I think we largely are focused on that as well. If you look at the NATO meetings that took place in Bucharest over the past couple of days, you look at the continued US funding for military assistance, you look at the package to support the energy sector, particularly the electricity grid that was announced by Secretary Blinken just 2 days ago. I think we are focused on a lot of those things. I would say the economy, getting the Ukrainian economy to rebound, is the most overlooked and critical item on the agenda. As you said, we've had these conferences. People get together and talk about reconstruction. I attended Lugano and Berlin. I've decided not to go to the one in Paris. I think I've seen what they do. But I'd say there are several things here that are not happening. There's no implementation, and I would make some specific recommendations. One is that we need to understand that this has to start now. It is not something that can wait. You don't wait for the end of the war and then say, okay, now let's rebuild. Ukraine has 40 million people. They have to live. They have to have jobs. They have to have an economy. It has to be functioning. And what we find is that we in the United States are providing about $1.5 billion a month in budgetary support for Ukraine. The European Union has pledged about 2 billion euros per month. But why are we doing this? We're doing this because the GDP has collapsed, and therefore the tax revenues have collapsed. So what we're doing is we're paying money to sustain a budget. We should be trying to get those tax revenues back up by getting the GDP back up. And we should be using public funds in smart ways to get the private sector in. And so that is a philosophy. One of the things that could be done and should be done right now is for the G7 countries and the European Union and anyone else who wants to to appoint a senior coordinator for Ukraine economic recovery in every capital. We need somebody who's actually made it their job to focus on this. And it needs to be someone with enough seniority and economic expertise, particularly financial sector, Wall Street, investment, someone who can bring the ideas to the table and has enough authority to dip into all of the different instruments of government, whether it's USAID or the Development Finance Corporation or Exim Bank or Treasury or the State Department, National Security Council, and so forth. We need someone who's in charge of this. And this group of people from the G7 countries, together with Ukrainian counterparts, should be setting priorities, and they should be identifying mechanisms, and they should be getting on with it now. Let's start doing things now. As I said, I think getting the private sector in is the key. Government handouts, government assistance will dry up, and you'll still need to have an economy. So we need to use what we have wisely in order to leverage private sector engagement. And I think one of the most important areas there is going to be covering the risk of future attacks. So risk insurance. And lots of us, in the United States, but lots of us have mechanisms for this already. Exim Bank would be the most logical one for the US, but cover the insurance risk. Get this backed up by commercial banks, but with a sovereign guarantee at the end. It'll spread the risk for US taxpayers, but it will also leverage a lot of private sector funding if they know that any potential losses would be covered. You could do the same thing with exports, so that if there are interruptions to Ukraine's ability to supply, that there would be guarantees of alternatives, so that there would be willingness to still contract with Ukraine for long-term exports. Those are just some of the ideas that I think is important to pursue, but it starts with putting somebody in charge of this here and in each of the other capitals, and it starts with a mentality that this has to get going right away, but we can't afford to wait.
Interesting what you said about appointing a senior coordinator from each of the G7 and EU countries. Is it time for a Reimagining-like process for a reconstruction and humanitarian relief, for that matter, for Ukraine, where people are not just having talk shops, but are actually organizing behind the scenes, maybe not publicly, not everything we will see publicly. As I recall, the Reimagining process was pushed first by the US Secretary of Defense. Do we need a similar process? Who might champion that process and get it going?
Yes, I would argue yes, I think we should. I think it's a good analogy. In the case of military assistance, it makes sense why the United States was the motor behind this, the impetus behind this. You could argue that this should be somebody from the G7. The Germans have the chairmanship now. It's passing to the Japanese in January. You could argue it could be the European Union, but it needs to be inclusive of all of the G7 countries, United States, EU, and so forth. We all have different mechanisms. I don't think the US would be comfortable with it being an only European thing. I don't think the Europeans would be comfortable if it was led by an American when they expect to be doing more and facilitating Ukraine's entry into the EU. But a group like that coordinates together, I think is very much needed. And since we have Anders sitting here, I'll just throw out that an example of the kind of person that would be good to pull this together would be like Carl Bildt, who has a lot of stature and seniority and knowledge about Ukraine. He works well with many, many countries, and he could chair a process like that that would then involve the representatives of each of the various nations.
Well, I was going to tee up on this, but you just did, so I won't have to do that anymore. Anders, where do you assess where Ukraine economy is today? What are the immediate needs, and what might be the future needs as we look forward to hopefully the war ending sooner rather than later?
Yeah, thank you very much. And first, let me thank and praise Nadia and Bob McConnell for all the work they are doing for US Ukraine Foundation, and thanks for the invitation here as Kurt already indicated, we discuss too much with one another, so we have very similar views. But this idea of a coordinator, as Ed just picked up on, I have not heard before, nor that Carl Bildt would be excellent as a chair of such a committee, which I absolutely agree on. People like that need to be taken care of and given the responsibility that they should have. I particularly like what both of you emphasize here on the Rammstein process is needed for the economic support. But let me answer your question first. Think of it. Ukraine's GDP is falling this year by probably 33%, exactly 1/3. And since the GDP last year was $200 billion, this is $70 billion that is lost. On top of that, we have at least $120 billion of recorded losses that the Kiev School of Economics and the Ukrainian Minister of Economy together have established. And of course, this will be much more. Already by the 1st of June, the World Bank came out with an assessment of $250 billion losses and what is needed to recover. On top of that, the economy needs to be profoundly restructured. No longer grids, pipelines, and highways and railways going to Russia, but to Europe. As it appears so far this year, 63% of Ukraine's exports goes to Europe. Before the war, it was 40%. So this is, of course, mainly a big decline, but it's also restructuring that is happening now. So we need to think of how to finance this. And as I said, I think that this Rammstein idea is good. Here the US has provided excellent coordination once a month of military support for Ukraine, and that functions just well. You have very little fight really about who should give what. It's rather where can we find the relevant ammunitions that is actually available. We don't have anything like that in the economic field. So what has happened? The US has been marvelously generous, both on the military and on the economic side. So the US has delivered during the second half of this year $1.5 billion a month to Ukraine. Ukraine needs approximately $5 billion a month because with a GDP that is down by 33%, the tax revenues are down more. So after having minimized the budget expenditures, Ukraine still needs $5 billion a month. And Europe promised more than it has delivered. And this is a serious concern. And now you are hearing from certain Republican congressmen complaints, why should we deliver more than the Europeans? And this is a serious argument. And fortunately, the European Union has now taken it seriously and seems to be making a decision on the 6th of December to deliver $8 billion next year, or euro. It's the same thing right now, actually. So the EU seems to be catching up. But the argument that is lying behind is that in May, the EU promised 9 billion euro for this year and will only deliver 6 billion euro. And this has nothing to do with Ukraine. The reason is that the German Minister of Finance thinks that one should not increase EU neutral indebtedness. And this, in order to get a disbursement from the European Union, you must have unity, a unanimous decision by 27 ministers of finance. And if you have a German minister of finance say, I'm not going to do this, then it doesn't happen. And then the EU looks completely unreliable because Ursula von der Leyen, as the good president of the European Commission, promised this last May. The European Parliament voted for it, the European Commission for it, but you must have the 27 ministers to agree in order to actually get it dispersed. And then, of course, Americans ask, well, do we know what the European ministers will do next year? So this is a serious concern of lack of reliability of European ministers. I hope it will be overcome, but this is the short-term problem.
Well, on that, let me ask both of you this question. That's the kind of slowness, to put it politely, of European economic support of Ukraine. Does that argue for European, like Carl Bildt, leading the process to say, kind of throw the responsibility at them, or does that argue for non-European to head this process? I have to say, personally, I'm a little bit concerned about Japan's G7 presidency next year, because obviously Japan is a little more remote from the situation on the ground in Europe. And in Berlin, you couldn't find a senior Japanese official at the conference, even though they will be taking the presidency very soon. How would the two of you help me think about that?
Well, first, I'm a little bit more upbeat about the Japanese than your question. I've met with representatives from the embassy here. I know a couple of people in the foreign ministry. I think they do take their G7 responsibility seriously. They want to be doing things, and they are very supportive of Ukraine, very, very much so, and very concerned about Russia. They have their own issues in Asia with Russia, the Kuril Islands and so forth. So they, I think, are in the right space. They would just need reassurance that the other members of the G7 would want them to push this. And I think we would actually have that. I think there would be agreement, but it would require a little bit more leadership. I do think, however, that European is the right person to be the head of such a process, because the ultimate objective is to use support for Ukraine in rebuilding its economy to rebuild it in such a way that it accelerates Ukraine's EU membership. And that's something where having a European at the top would emphasize that and make sure that's the direction it goes in.
Yeah, let me just continue on it. I think that what we are seeing is that the EU wanted last spring to take the lead of this. And then the G7 said, really? Are you capable of doing that? Are you fast enough and effective enough? And the EU said, no, perhaps not. And there was a sort of agreement that has emerged that G7 should be the leading body. And what we are seeing now is that the G7 is really becoming much more important. And of course, the G7 also includes the European Union. So you can say that it's the US plus the European Union, and also the UK, Canada, and Japan. So this is a suitably small but sufficiently large group of countries. So I think that this is likely to be the leading group. And then you, of course, have a question, where will the secretariat of this group be? And I see two institutions that are now offering such a secretariat. The European Union has promised an independent part of the European Commission, so it will not be controlled by the European Commission, which I think is perfectly sensible. Also, the World Bank says we are, of course, happy to manage it. And you might know that the World Bank is actually through a trust fund managing the whole US support to the Ukrainian budget, because the US does not have suitable routines for that, and the World Bank does. So the World Bank here is very effective and works. The institution that is strangely missing in action is the IMF. The IMF only on the 23rd of November came with an agreement with Ukraine, which contains no money. So this is just absurd. Normally, when there is a macroeconomic crisis, and Ukraine's inflation is now 27%, and then you have a macroeconomic crisis, the reason is that there is not enough financing for the budget. And the IMF is doing whatever it can to stay out of it. And now they have adopted a program without any financing for Ukraine for 4 months. While the IMF, the EIB, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development are all very active in the action. And the European Commission does whatever it can until it comes up to the facing the German Minister of Finance. Which is difficult to overcome. So I think that we are seeing, I would say also on Lugano and Berlin, they have sort of shown that it needs to be G7 and a quite independent secretariat somewhere that should emerge. But who would lead it? And what structure it would, we don't have an answer to us yet.
I was remiss in not mentioning that the European Commission president did offer Brussels or the EU to be the secretariat of such an effort. And what concerned me more was she said maybe started by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. That sounds a little late. From my point of view. Personally, I'd rather have them be housed in Bonn, where there are a lot of empty office buildings, and put the burden on the Germans. But that's just me talking. I guess the other point I would make, kind of building on Kurt, your point about European integration for Ukraine, is that part of Ukraine's weakness for the last 30 years is this incomplete transition from the Soviet economy. And this war should have changed everything now in terms of the narratives that Ukrainians should be thinking about. And European integration is clearly the direction that is the right way to go, plus what the Ukrainians want. And reimagining reconstruction means how do you transform this country with its wonderful human resources as well as natural resources into an asset for Europe rather than as a liability for Europe, which unfortunately a lot of Europeans have seen it that way up until recently. So not only is Ukraine defending European interests in many ways in this war, it can also be helping Europe economically. And that's not a vision that has been well articulated yet, but might move the momentum towards doing something sooner rather than later. I wonder if the two of you would have reflections on this. On this.
Yeah, I think very much that one should combine 3 processes: EU accession, reconstruction of Ukraine, and to complete the reforms. And given that there would be quite another amount of money available, hopefully, there would be much more force, much more leverage behind the reforms this time around. And I must praise the EU for having offered candidate status to Ukraine in June, which is extremely important. And during the first half of next year, Sweden will be the chair of the European Council, which is actually quite important. And my hope is that Sweden will be able to push for the EU agreeing on a mandate for starting negotiations on a membership of Ukraine. If this is properly done, it takes 3 to 4 years. That's what has happened with Lithuania and Poland. And I think that Ukraine is completely ripe for this now. for example, that millions of Ukrainians have been outside of the country, have reconsidered their lives and how they work and live. This is what happened in Poland in the 1980s. That made Poland so ripe for fundamental reforms. So I look very positively on this. Now there is a certain disagreement within the G7. Should really the EU accession process be central to the reconstruction process? That is not quite obvious, but these are things that can be sorted out.
In fact, there is a meeting happening in Stockholm today to discuss their presidency coming up of the EU for the next 6 months. Kurt?
Yeah, let me just build on something that you said, Ed, because I think you put it very well, that Europe needs to look at Ukraine as an asset, not a liability. And you think about the human capital, you think about the natural resources, you think about the agriculture, you think about mining, you think about rare earth minerals, you think about energy, including the ability to replace Russian energy supplies to Europe. It is a real asset for Europe if you adopt that mindset, that way of thinking. And you could really say that Ukraine can be part of the solution for many European problems. And what I would do, and I'm heading to Stockholm, not today, but next week, try to encourage the Swedes to particularly pick up the energy sector as one where there should be some major initiatives now to accelerate Ukraine becoming an energy supplier for Europe, because this will provide a business basis for payments to Ukraine. It will provide energy supplies to Europe at lower cost for consumers, and it will replace Russian energy, and it will be one more area where you can accelerate Ukraine's reforms, which are desperately needed. So I think picking a sector like that, and particularly that sector, is something that the EU could get started with right now. And it would be providing solutions for the EU rather than only being a source of budgetary payments.
I'm sure it's a pure coincidence that you picked energy.
Well, I mean, look at what the Russians are doing now. They're trying to turn the lights out. So I think it's imperative for the rest of us to say, okay, then let's roll up our sleeves.
Kurt, I know you have a plane to catch in about 10 minutes. So I want to open this up to the audience and see if there's some urgent question that a member of the audience would like to ask you. Anyone? If not, Anders has a question that he wants to ask me. I know for sure that I'm really trying to avoid. But Nadia.
Well, the point that you've made about getting Europeans to see Ukraine as an asset versus a liability. You know, we saw this in the military side. It took a while for people to appreciate that we were learning as much from the Ukrainians as what we were teaching them, and the innovation, as I mentioned. So how do we begin this narrative, or what could be the opening door to promoting this whole idea that Ukraine is an asset?
Well, I think, yeah, you put your finger on it with the military, and what we will see at the end of the war is Ukraine having the largest, the best equipped, and the most experienced military in Europe. So I always joke with people, it would be dangerous not to have them in NATO. And likewise, I think if you start with some sectors, and we mentioned energy, another one you could start with is software engineering, digital engineering, where Ukraine is very strong. But start with a sector or two where you can see the results, and then it'll click with people and say, aha, we can actually do this.
Yeah, let me follow up on this. If we take the sectors, I mean, energy is obvious because here there's no competition at all. Europe needs it. And as Kurt emphasized, Ukraine can produce very green energy. In the very south of Ukraine, there's a lot of wind and solar energy, unfortunately not in occupied territories, but we trust that will be cleaned out. And I understand that even if the Russians have stolen some of this, most of it remains. I talked to one investor who had 88 wind turbines. 4 had been destroyed. The others are just standing there. And this is one of the big foreign investors in the south of Ukraine. And green hydrogen and, of course, gas production. Ukraine has the biggest gas reserves in Europe, as you so well know. And then we have high tech, the software, where Ukraine is very strong. And this is not a competitive area for Europe. This is a complementary also. And the third important issue is the European supply chain. Important car part factories have already developed in Western Ukraine, and they are German and Japanese. These are the kind of companies that you never hear of because they only sell to car companies. They don't sell to people. Only to companies. So these are the 3 big areas that are quite obvious that they should develop. Then we have sensitive areas, and that's agriculture, steel, and chemicals. Chemicals are now where you have a lot of protectionism in Europe, and the Europeans don't really want to import too much of it. And chemicals are by and large out, bombed, and destroyed, or too high gas prices. Steel, even more bombed out than the chemicals. So that is not a big issue any longer. Then we have agriculture. Ukrainian agriculture is splendid. But in the short run, I just looked, the Ukrainian harvest so far this year, grain harvest, is only 40 million tons. Less than half of what it was last year. And this is the cost of Russia very concretely in the fields. So therefore, I don't think that is a big problem, because otherwise, think of the French wheat farmers. They are the big, they are big producers, and they're big opponents of excessive imports from Ukraine. So I don't think that will be much of a problem. So therefore, as Ed and Kurt so rightly emphasized, Ukraine now looks much more as an opportunity and as a potential for Europe than it has done before. Because traditionally 80% of Ukraine's exports have been agricultural produce and steel, exactly what Europe does not really want to import too much of.
Robert, did you have an urgent question or an announcement?
I have a question from one of our watchers virtually.
Okay.
It's for Kurt. Why is the German finance minister opposing the funding, and what can be done to change his mind?
Great question. The German finance minister is from the Free Democrat Party, and he is concerned that if you open the pipeline, open the spigot to support Ukraine, that there will be more and more demands for opening the spigot within Europe. Countries that have high debt ratios and that need assistance with budgetary support, particularly big ones like Italy, or the experience they had with Greece 10 years ago. So that is what he's resisting. I think how do you persuade him? I think van der Leyen may be very important in this, and she's been pushing the envelope even just yesterday with a few statements that she made. I think that U.S. leadership saying, we are doing this, but we need you to do it as well. And then I think, as with van der Leyen, what she said yesterday about seizing Russian frozen assets, she's making a case that Russia's war crimes make this a different circumstance than just other frozen assets. And I think that's a very important point to make with the Germans as well. It wouldn't be just budgetary support anytime. It's the special case here of the aggression and the war crimes that need attention. That's, I think, some of the best arguments you can make.
Anders, do you have any comment on
Yeah,
this?
let me add a bit because Germany is really quite complicated in this matter. And you know, there are three parties in our coalition. And the Greens that have the economy minister, that's energy, and foreign affairs, they are, with regard to Ukraine, excellent. Then we have the Social Democrats, who are in charge of defense deliveries, who are completely confused. So therefore, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing in the Social Democratic Party in Germany. And therefore, they contradict themselves about deliveries of arms to Ukraine. And I'm not sufficiently competent, perhaps Curtis, to say what is really happening. And then we have the Free Democratic Party, which holds the Minister of Finance. And that is a properly run party where the leader decides everything, and that's Christian Linden. And nobody in his party or in the government can oppose him. So therefore, one has to handle him. And that can be the EU leaderships. They are now trying to do it by pushing the decision-making for the next year early with clear conditionality. And they want to have Minister of Finance from Germany to agree on this on the 6th of December so that they can settle for next year. So the idea is to get it done early and clearly and more transparently so that he can't hide. That's the idea. The other is that the fundamental problem here is with the COVID finance in Europe, 750 billion euro. Half of it should be loans and half of it should be grants. Germany doesn't like that, doesn't like to have additional indebtedness of the European Union. So the German idea is instead to give grants from the state national budget directly to Ukraine. And Germany actually did so in the summer. It gave 1 billion euro to Ukraine and in grant, which was great. But then Germany said, no, we have done our job. Why haven't you done yours? And this is not how a multilateral organization like the European Union functions, and that was somehow ignored. And I can't really understand. I think
I'm going to have to take off. Thank you so much, Bob and Nadia. I appreciate being here. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to pick up on something that Kurt said, that ultimately public dollars would not be sufficient for reconstruction. That ultimately Ukraine needs to be an attractive place for the private sector to invest, because if you look at the estimates of what reconstruction is going to cost, hundreds of billions of dollars, there's not enough taxpayers' money in all the countries we're talking about, particularly at this time. To do that. So a lot of reforms that have been delayed, such as a independent and non-corrupt judiciary, rule of law, protection of property rights, all those things that, Anders, you have written quite a bit about over the years on Ukraine, all those need to be put on the front burner now. If we are going to reimagine Ukraine reconstruction as opposed to putting Ukraine back where it was before.
Yeah, let me pick up on that. Fortunately, the EU has put in their 7 conditions for Ukraine to maintain the candidate status, exactly these points that you mentioned. Establish a proper rule of law through a judicial reform, improve the anti-corruption process, and a few similar conditions. My fear is that this is not being done now, and it needs to be done until the end of this year. And this would be a serious impediment. But let me jump to another question. I have a piece in Kiev Post today about the $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, which should be confiscated. They are in 7 Western countries: Canada, the US, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Austria, and Japan. But nobody says we hold so and so much of this money. And the central banks like having reserves from another central bank, so they don't want to expose themselves. Ministries of justice and ministries of finance don't like confiscation. They think that is against private property rights, although this is obviously does not involve private property rights because this is state financing. So the obvious thing that should be done, take this money, use it for war reparations. We've already established approximately that much that Russia has cost Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen yesterday came up with a similar proposal, but said that this money should be taken for the time being, but then it should be given back after the sanctions have been eased on Russia. The Russian damage to Ukraine does not ease because the sanctions are ended. So this money should be used. But I was very happy to see that she touched upon it properly. So this is the big thing. But let me, since nobody is posing questions to you as the moderator, let me ask you as the big expert on energy. Is a price cap for Russian oil realistic? If so, how would it work? What would the price for Russian oil be in your book?
I was afraid you would ask that question. I've been a skeptic about the oil price cap idea, first privately when Treasury first floated the idea in the spring, and then on record by June, hoping to head off the G7 leaders' discussion of it. But I now have a different problem with the oil price cap idea, which is how long it took for them to implement it. I mean, as far as I know, we still don't have an official announcement. The Wall Street Journal reported this morning that the EU or the Commission is asking for its members to approve a $60 price cap, and that is about the amount that has been rumored for the last couple of weeks now. So now my concern is, one is delayed. So the implementation will not actually start on December 5th as it will be advertised, since if you were shipping a cargo of crude oil from, let's say, the Russian Baltics port to India, that cargo would already be on the way. And so now we're talking about grace period until sometime in January 17th or 19th. So now we have delay in the implementation, the price cap, and the cap is, in my mind, set too low. I mean, set too high, I'm sorry, I misspoke. $60 per barrel is more than what Russia is selling its oil for today. Russia is selling its oil because it has to discount it so that buyers from India, China, Turkey would want to have it at about something in the order of $52, $53 per barrel today. So $60 per barrel is no cap at all. And my concern is that it's likely to be set more as a floor for Russian oil price rather than as a cap. So there are numerous concerns having to do with how practical it is to enforce a price cap and so on. I have to reflect a bit because I actually promised some people that I would write a column on this as soon as the official announcement come out, which it definitely needs to come up before December 5th, I would think. Otherwise, the Western alliance would really be seen as feckless if it cannot meet its own deadlines. So I am concerned that it won't be as effective. And I think one of the things to think about is that economic sanctions take a long time to have an impact. I mean, that we know from historical experience. Oil embargoes are notoriously leaky. I mean, otherwise, we may have seen political change in Iran or Venezuela by now. And so there is no actual substitute for changing the conditions on the ground and the battlefield, which is a nice segue to the national security discussion that will be coming up. And if anyone thought that an oil price cap will, within a very short period of time, stop Russian aggression, I think they would be disappointed. So it really is a matter of how do you change the facts on the ground, and economic sanctions is necessary and can be helpful, but insufficient by themselves to get the job done, in my mind.
Yeah, let me draw on this, that I mentioned that the Ukrainian GDP is probably down 33% this year, while the Russian GDP will only fall by 3 to 4% this year. And the forecasts for next year are generally similar, but of course very uncertain, depending on what conditions will be. And something very important here is the energy prices, primarily the oil price. So what we have learned this year is, first, that the financial sanctions that look very tough in the beginning have turned out to have had much less effect than we expected, while the export controls of electronics to Russia have turned out to be much more effective than we could have hoped. And while the energy sanctions so far seem to have been a big mess, and if anything, delivered higher prices for Russia. So let me continue on the other parts that you happily avoided, namely the gas issue. Can Europe stop buying Russian gas, as its attempt on doing now? And if so, what will be the effects be? We have seen during this year that gas prices in Europe have been higher than they ever have been before, several times higher. And what is going to happen now?
Who invited you anyway? Just to complete the thought on the oil price cap, in my mind, even if a oil price cap were practical and enforceable, it would have to be below $50 a barrel to have any impact on Russian oil revenue. Otherwise, as I said earlier, $60 cap is really no cap at all.
You should write an op-ed on that.
I plan to as soon as the session is over. On gas, what we know is that in pursuing this war, unprovoked, brutal war against Ukraine, Russia, Putin, has destroyed the compact between Russia and Europe on energy, particularly on gas. I mean, it used to be argued that no matter what happened in the world, Russia was always a reliable supplier to Europe. And he has completely destroyed that now. And I don't really understand why. I mean, that's not an energy question. That is really a political question. Maybe he thought that he would win the war in 3 days, and therefore the Europeans would be happy to continue to receive Russian gas. That's turned out not to be true. So I think the era of Russian gas, representing 40% of European gas imports, that era is over, and most likely permanently. So the question is now, where will Europe get its gas? And where it has done, of course, is to import LNG from around the world. It has been somewhat lucky in that the winter has been mild until very recently. And the Chinese economy is down. And therefore, a lot of LNG, liquefied natural gas, previously destined for Asia, has now been rerouted to Europe instead. I think the situation is still very precarious because you just don't turn around these big volumes as well as construct new LNG facilities, particularly on the production side. You can't do that overnight. So if you and I wanted to sign a new LNG contract tomorrow, there is no available volumes until 2026, at least. You can't even order a new LNG tanker before expecting delivery before 2026. So all these things will take a long time. So I think Europe is going to be in a very difficult spell for the next 3 to 5 years on gas. And this is in spite of all the things that they're doing on conservation, on moving to renewable energy and so on. But I just don't see the return of the previous Soviet and then Russian gas relationship to Europe in the future. That causes Russia a big problem because the alternative markets are very far away and you have to ship them on pipelines that don't yet exist. Even the Chinese have been reluctant to sign on to Power of Siberia 2 up until now. And so I think this is going to cause Russia a big problem in its gas sector, as well as oil in the long run, because they've broken what people previously thought was that the oil and gas relationship was too important to Russia for it to want to break the sanctity of contract relationship with Europe and vice versa. And I think that's gone now permanently. I don't know if there are any more questions or because
Either a question or a
we're-
topic for your next articles. Each of you, I think, has mentioned that it's going to take more than governments for the reconstruction rebuilding. It's going to take the private sector. Should that not be part of the process immediately to have the private sector engage? And is that being contemplated?
If you ask me, you don't get private investment early on. And if you get private investment early on, it's vulture investment, which you don't really want. So what you do want is, of course, private contractors. And they should be allowed to operate, and they should be given the proper risk, political risk coverage. So I just want to make that distinction.
Well, I would endorse Anders' mention of political risk insurance and build on that by saying, you know, there's nothing that attracts foreign investment more than success. So what Ukraine needs is to create success stories, because if Anders makes an investment and makes a huge return, I'm going to be thinking, well, why aren't I doing what Anders is doing, right? And I will want to get into that space. And somehow Ukrainian government in this post-war reconstruction period has to get across that there is a new day for private sector investment in Ukraine, that the government will not want to manually control the economy as previous Ukrainian governments have done in the past, and creating success stories in each of the sectors that Anders very helpfully mentioned would be the way I would go if I were advising the Ukrainian government.
Yeah, let me add on that. We already have these producers of car parts in Western Ukraine. They are there and they can expand, and that's in the peaceful parts of Ukraine. Software can function everywhere, and it has done very well in Ukraine in the course of the war. And then the third is gas production. Ukraine has for decades needed big investment from serious Western energy companies. And now with these gas prices, they should come in. And Ukraine has the biggest gas reserves in Europe. Part of them are in Western Ukraine, where you would not fear war too much. Of course, most of it is in the east, but a substantial part is also in the west. So here you have three areas that should be quite fine. And the agriculture is developing regardless of everything.
But just on the energy or gas question, but the precondition is that Ukraine will have to articulate a vision that says the government is not going to set gas prices, for example, and interfere with the operations of building a true gas market internally that's also linked to the European gas market, that Naftahas need not be producing 70% of Ukrainian domestic gas forever, right? So what is the role of this state oil and gas company? So questions like that needs to be addressed in a proper professional way, particularly for long lead time industries like energy. And without that, then we're down to software and agriculture and maybe furniture making in the West and other things. But long lead time investments will require a different Ukrainian view on the government's role in economic policy. So, well, thank you all very much for your attention. I think we're intruding on the time of the next panel. So.